Hey there, welcome to the first episode of Season 2 of the Open Floor Podcast. I'm Ali Mosallai.
And I'm Aryan Narayan.
And man, does it feel good to be back. We're thrilled to introduce a bunch of changes to the podcast, so be sure to check out our pilot episode for a brief recap.
We have so many interesting episode ideas for you guys this season, but we want to start this season off by discussing how the education system is impacted due to the COVID-19 pandemic with Lexington, Massachusetts Public Schools Superintendent Dr. Julie Hackett. This episode was recorded on September 3rd, 2020, so things may have changed by the time you are listening to this episode, and some of the information may be out of date.
Now, without further ado, on to the episode.
In Season 1, we made a couple of episodes highlighting the thoughts of students on how COVID-19 has impacted the education system and asked them to comment on the various new learning blueprints that colleges and school districts have published. Check out those episodes if you haven't already.
However, at the time of this recording, coronavirus cases are still on the rise in quite a few states across the United States, and many are worried if there will be a second, stronger wave of this virus. Amidst all of this doubt, some school systems have yet to make decisions regarding which of these blueprints they will implement in the coming year.
There's been a lot of debate about the merits and drawbacks of the major back-to-school plans that have been presented by the administrations of school districts. Parents, who worry about the quality of education their children will receive online, mostly reject complete remote learning in favor of hybrid learning plans, which many teachers believe are both unsafe and would lead to a decreased quality of education.
Now that it's September and many schools are beginning the reopening process, it's important to talk about the return to school plans that are currently being assessed. And so we're delighted to welcome our special guest who has had the most experience when it comes to the development of back to school plans, Dr. Julie Hackett, Superintendent of the Lexington Public Schools. Thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so many of our listeners may be unaware of the specifics of the back-to-school blueprint that the Lexington Public Schools have published. And so could you please describe kind of the most important elements of the blueprint and the options that are available to students and teachers in the coming year?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. The blueprint that we developed was developed, first of all, from a planning perspective. Back in May, we put together a plan for how we were going to tackle the return to school problem. And in that planning memo, we outlined steps for being able to arrive at a decision with stakeholders represented. And we worked closely with our educators, our union representatives, individuals in the school system, and we were guided by the information that we got from our community. And the idea was to develop a plan that the community could react to, that we would revise, that would be fluid in nature, and to share that with the public, including students, staff, and parents. And the blueprint was published, the first draft, in June, which was earlier than in most places. And I think the necessity of being able to have a plan in June was related to what the community expectations are here in Lexington around planning. We know that it's important to have good plans in place. And as you said in your opening remarks, the quality of education is critical for everyone, and parents place a high value on that in our community, as do students and staff. So we wanted to do some early thinking about what that looked like. And we were also waiting for state guidance that just didn't come early on. And we were trying to solve problems that obviously are quite complex. So we put the blueprint together, and it essentially outlines a strategy whereby students and families have a choice between remote learning or hybrid learning, which is both in person and remote. And the basic premise is that because our schools are very crowded and because we are dealing with a pandemic, we wanted to have a strategy that would keep everyone as safe as possible and give some in-person opportunities, because we know that they have a great bearing on students' social and emotional health and well-being, and that's what the plan sets forth.
So, over the course of this summer, LPS has shared multiple drafts of the back-to-school blueprint with families of students as well as teachers, and they've collected feedback on both of the models of learning that were in these blueprints. So, what concerns were raised about both of these two new learning models, and which of the two is more popular?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure that the concerns were so much related to the two learning models being hybrid and remote as it was um, related to what some community members perceived as missing, and that would be the full return to school. So we had, as I described, we'd begun our planning process early on before the state issued guidelines, and we felt we couldn't wait anymore to plan out what a return to school would be like. And as it turned out, the state guidance ended up coming end of July, beginning of August. So for most school systems, unless you're going to implement explicitly what you've been told to implement, that's too late. It takes a long time to plan for a return to school, particularly if it's different. So our planning process happened, and it was clear, given that we are in a pandemic, and I'll take your school, for example, because people know in the community that the high school is very overcrowded, and we're trying to deal with that issue by putting in an application for a new high school through the Massachusetts School Building Authority. But using Lexington High School is just one example. It was very clear early on that it would be impossible to maintain safe social distances and have a full return to school. And we have people in the community who have varying perspectives and ideas about what the fall return to school should look like. Some people want full return to school, no changes from what it was in years past. Others want full remote. And then some want some kind of combination, which is the hybrid of in-person and remote learning. So the feedback, I think, primarily was around where is the plan for the full return. And our response to that was that there is no plan for full return at this time because we don't think it's safe in the Lexington Public Schools. And in our work with the Board of Health, what was clear very early on for us is that in order to be safe, we needed to maintain 6-foot social distances and always have masks for any sort of in-person learning. And in order to do that, a full return just wasn't possible.
Right. Now, I want to return back to what you had mentioned that the blueprints were published sometime in June, the drafts of them. And so definitely with the impactful nature of this situation back in March, the administrations of neighboring school districts around LPS kind of collaborated together in making the ultimate decision to close schools. And so considering that now we're approaching the potential start of the school year, how have Lexington's own plans for reopening been influenced by the decisions of its fellow school systems across the state and country?
When we decided to close schools on March 12th, I organized a meeting among superintendents in the area and talked about the challenges and worked to get a collaborative response to how we were going to approach the school closure. And in fact, several school districts signed on. So it's always helpful if you can work with nearby school districts and with colleagues to get a unified approach. And that was helpful in March. Since then, just as one recent example, last week we had 2 meetings related to athletics, and this is just one small sliver of what we're dealing with when we think about pandemic planning. Similar to the approach that I just described for March, I reached out to colleagues in the Middlesex County or the Middlesex League to see if we could get a unified response to fall sports. And we also included Middlesex athletic directors in that discussion and ended up coming up with a consensus agreement on how we would approach the fall sports and which sports would play, when they would play, how we would deal with transportation, how we would deal with stipends and things of that nature. So the collaboration continues. And then I'd also say, as we look at what's happening, not only with school systems in our area, but across the country, I think there are great examples of what not to do. And those are important as what we do. And we've watched, for example, what's happened in some states in the southern part of the country, and how they were quickly moving back to school. And what happened in many cases is because there was a lot of haste about a return to school, in a very short period of time, they ended up right back out and in remote. And so our strategy has been to think critically about what we're seeing across the country and to figure out how we can have a sustainable return for the fall.
Yeah, and the most important part about that sustainable return is, especially in a hybrid format, making sure that everyone on campus, including the students, faculty, and other members of the staff, are safe. So, what precautions and safety measures will be put in place in order to minimize risk for those who will be in hybrid learning this fall? And what shortcomings might exist in these precautions?
One of the things I feel really good about with the plan is that we have paid a lot of attention to health and safety, and the blueprint outlines some of the specific strategies. But just to give you a sample, first of all, we acquired our PPE early in the process, and we have all of the supplies and materials we need for a successful start to school. I already mentioned the 6-foot social distances. And by the way, when the initial state guidance came out, the idea was for everybody to be 3 feet apart. In some cases, this was a controversial piece of information, but based on everything that we had been practicing in communities, whether you were, out at the grocery store or going into a public space, the first thing we see when we walk into these buildings is a sign that says stay 6 feet apart and maximum occupancy and things of that nature. So it seemed counterproductive to be thinking about anything less than 6 feet. 3 feet just wasn't part of the conversation for us and for many communities. And I think the initial plan or thought statewide was that people would implement the 3 feet. And by the way, 3 feet is what you're used to as students when you're in a school building. You know that your desks are about 3 feet apart. And so for many educators, I think that whole 3-foot discussion felt like we were backing into a business as usual, return to school as we've always done kind of model. And again, that was the recommendation of the state. So we didn't take that recommendation, and we worked with our Board of Health and just used good common sense to say that that's not adequate, and we're going to maintain 6-foot social distance and have masks on at all times. One of the other pieces of guidance from the state was that K2 masks could be optional, and we're saying that masks are not optional. People need to use masks, and we know that in some cases this may be not possible for kids who have disabilities and things of that nature. So we're working around the safety precautions in different ways with kids with unique needs. And so I think the distances and the mask wearing and the PPE are a few examples of the safety precautions, but there are many more. Our work around air quality and air assessment, I think, has been critical to the return to school. And early on, we established a 3-part process with the Board of Health, where we would be able to verify that the air quality was in fact safe so that we could return our school community to our school buildings in safe ways. And what we know from the scientific studies related to the pandemic is the aerosolization is a major concern. So making sure that the air quality is safe is critical. Just very briefly, what we did for a 3-step process is, first of all, our Department of Public Facilities has a great handle on the carbon dioxide emissions in our schools. They monitor that closely. I think in many school systems, that verification by the Department of Facilities would be enough, and they would say, okay, they verified that we have a good fresh air exchange, so we're done and schools are safe and you should all come back. But we said very early on, it's not enough to have our own internal people verify the safety of the air quality. We want outside eyes looking at how we're analyzing our systems. And we hired a consultant in that case. This is environmental health and engineering. And we asked them to come in and check the air quality school by school, which they've done. And then as a third check, we have the Board of Health reviewing the environmental health and engineering's analysis and verifying that we have adequate air quality or good air quality so that people can return safely. And this is a system, a 3-part system, or an outside third-party check that others have adopted based on the work that we did early on. There are many other elements, even just related to scheduling and how we developed plans so that we could cohort kids carefully that factor into this, but that would take your entire podcast to go through, so I'll just stop there.
And so I think a good way to like condense it all together is that Lexington is doing all it can to make sure that there's a safe return to campus this year in the hybrid learning. And so, however, providing the safety to students and staff could potentially come at the cost of the traditional schooling experience. And so how have these new precautions impacted, if at all, the quality of education that students receive? And I think mostly targeting the hybrid learning model.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't educate in a pandemic and not have trade-offs. There are trade-offs with all of this, and thinking through those trade-offs in critical ways is an important part of the planning as well. The high school schedule, just as one example, we had a process in place whereby educators and administrators came together to develop the schedule that they thought best suited the needs of the students based on some parameters that we set up. So, for example, cohorting was a priority, reduction of teacher planning was a priority, knowing that we would need people to sort of help out and pitch in with the many challenges that this pandemic creates for educators in the workplace. We had a number of different measures, safety, equity being right at the top of the list for scheduling teams. And scheduling teams work together to develop schedules and ways of delivering the curriculum to students that would be the most conducive to learning and still take into account the safety and equity considerations that I just mentioned. And the teams then presented to me and to members of our planning team who helped with the back to school blueprint. And then we had an opportunity to ask questions and to ask them to modify their plans according to questions if that was appropriate. And then they came up with a final schedule, which perhaps you saw in the videos that were shared by principals throughout the system. And at the high school level, this is one example, and there are other examples for elementary and middle, but just for an example at the high school level, they were able to deliver a multitude of student choices without reducing what you're able to take. And they felt like that was a critical priority because one of our elements of our strategic plan and our vision is this notion of student agency and making sure that you as young people have the ability to learn and to choose in ways that you wish and to be very active agents in your own learning. So that was a consideration in how they developed the schedule. And while some school systems have limited what a person can take for the curriculum, we didn't in Lexington, and in particular at Lexington High School. So you still have access to that compendium of classes. I know there were rumors early on that we wouldn't be able to have advanced placement classes, for example, or people would have their options reduced. And they found ways to make that not have to be the case. And also, I think to answer the question about what did give through this process, I would say that some of how that curriculum is delivered had to be over the course of 4 weeks at the high school level. So we kind of stretched that out in order to be able to comply with safety and equity considerations. So all very complicated, but definitely some trade-offs. I think stretching out how that curriculum is delivered over the course of 4 weeks is one of them. And the good news is that students have still a wide variety of choices, which I also agree is very important.
Yeah, speaking of a wide variety of choices, although remote learning certainly carries less risk for students and the faculty, as well as their respective families, it also presents unique challenges in both teaching for teachers and learning for students. So, how does the quality of education in the remote learning model differ from hybrid learning?
So the remote learning model has evolved since the spring. It is different than the hybrid learning, just in the fact that there is no in-person component. But as we worked through the planning process, the leadership team worked hard to align what's happening in the Remote Learning Academy with the remote week of the hybrid model so that there's close integration. And part of the reason for doing that is that we wanted to make sure that if there's a time when we have to revert to remote learning entirely again, and you've all heard the stories and conversations about the potential surge in the fall that we may be facing with the pandemic, we wanted the ability to more or less be able to flip a switch and have our students and staff be able to enter into remote learning if that was needed. The challenges that we had in the spring relative to remote learning were pretty significant. And I think that was not just in Lexington, not just statewide, but throughout the nation. We were asking educators to do something that had never been done before. We also modified what was being done by about half as people were wrapping their minds around a pandemic. And I think that's been a piece of the conversation that's been lost. So when people indicated that the remote learning experience was underwhelming in the spring, for example, I think people forgot that part of the charge that we had was to reduce the amount of teaching and learning by half. And I think that, for me at least, helps us understand better why there was a challenge statewide around this issue of what remote learning looked like in the spring. But nevertheless, there were challenges that we experienced. We've been able to ramp up to what we're able to deliver in the fall by giving 2,400 hours of professional learning opportunities to staff. And I say giving, they took advantage of the 2,400 hours of learning just in June and July, by the way, because we have extremely dedicated educators who want to do the best for students like you and the many out there. So they've learned a lot along the way. We've also had, we had 65 technology workshops delivered throughout the spring that people took advantage of. We've had lots of conversation about how to build relationships through remote learning platforms and things of that nature. So I think the challenges you referenced are going to be mitigated somewhat when we get back to school in the fall for all of these reasons. Though, when you do something new and when you're living during a pandemic, the challenges are sure to continue. So I'm optimistic but practical in that we'll experience more, but we'll work through it.
That's true. And so I think at the moment, the primary focus in planning the return to school has been providing access to the primary subjects and a core curriculum. However, there are also extracurricular activities such as sports and clubs, and they're a major part of a student's daily life. Let's say outside of the the school time frame. And so, how has LPS taken the importance of these out of school activities into account, and how will they be handled this fall and throughout the coming school year?
One of the things that I learned from students during the student chats I had as we were developing the blueprint was that you all really wanted the ability to engage in extracurriculars, clubs, and activities, as you mentioned, sports if it was appropriate. And what we've done is we've built into our plans the ability for you to do that, whether that's virtually or in person safely. And in the fall, when you return to school, you're going to have the opportunity to engage in those clubs and activities and the fall sports, like I mentioned earlier, in safe ways. And we know that that's important to the social and emotional well-being of our students and our staff, by the way, who love to engage with our students in ways that are not necessarily related to just content and curriculum. Those are important ways too, but this helps us get to know one another and build those healthy relationships that will carry us through this ongoing pandemic.
And so I think we're almost to the end of our discussion. However, I think one question that everyone's wondering is when we might actually return to school as we had it before COVID-19. And so how would the status of the pandemic have to change for it to become feasible to return to full in-person learning? And when hypothetically could this happen?
The question that you're asking me is the question I get asked a lot. So it's wise of you to bring it up in this podcast. And I think that people want a quick and straightforward answer to when is it going to be full remote? When is it going to be full return? What are the conditions under which hybrid exists? And the conversation statewide is around trigger metrics and which trigger metric will you use that will tell us when there's a full return to school, for example. And what I can tell you is that my conversations with the Board of Health are around these items as well. And what I hear back from them and what I agree with is that it's not so simple a problem to be resolved through one trigger metric. So people want me to say, perhaps as an example, when a vaccine is created, then we will have a full return to school. Or, when the positivity rate of the pandemic is this, it will be a full return to school. And this is a complex situation. The Board of Health has indicated that there's no one trigger metric that will do that for them. It's a complex issue, and it's going to take almost a matrix of considerations to be able to answer that question. Not to mention the fact that everything that we are learning about the pandemic evolves, and it evolves quite rapidly. So just as an example, you'll remember back in March that the guidance we got at one point in time was that we shouldn't wear face masks, right? People said, not people, the federal government said that wasn't what we needed to do. Then we got updates from the CDC. They changed their position, and now we're in this regular routine and habit of wearing face masks when before we were told not to. So that's one example of the evolution of this pandemic in a very short period of time. And I think, there are other examples. So for example, we were conditioned not to touch surfaces because people didn't know and scientists didn't know how the virus was spreading. And many of us would leave packages outside so that we wouldn't get the germs of whomever delivered the package. And now we know that it's less a surface issue and more an aerosolization issue. So we're learning all the time, and to lock ourselves into one way of saying this is when we return would be somewhat short-sighted, because there are many unknowns, and we'll learn things in the next few weeks, I'm sure, that we didn't know earlier. So we need to continue to have that conversation and think that through. And the partnership we have with the Board of Health in Lexington is a very strong one. And we're talking about these things all the time, but there's no straightforward answer.
So you mentioned how difficult this process has been for everyone involved with it in the planning of how we might return to school. But a lot of our listeners actually want to know, what's the most rewarding part of your job during the pandemic?
Oh, I love this question. Thank you so much for thinking about this. Always for me, it's these moments, talking to you and having students reach out and say, hey, we want to help with this problem, and we want to give back to our community in ways and be creative. And I think that that's been so uplifting and just so wonderful for me to see. I had students stop by last week and deliver face shields that they made and developed using 3D printing machines. I've had young people reach out to talk about inventions that they created related to the pandemic. And I think the beauty in all of this, and there has to be beauty in everything that we do, otherwise we don't get very inspired in the work that we do. But I mean, for me, the beauty has been that kids' passion, creativity, and generosity of spirit have shown through in every way. And I am just so proud to be the superintendent in Lexington.
And so this was our discussion with Superintendent Dr. Hackett.
So right now, life is really confusing for all of us, particularly with regards to education in this unprecedented pandemic. So thank you so much for taking some of your valuable time to come onto our podcast and providing some much needed clarity to this complex situation.
Right. You can find Dr. Hackett on Twitter at LexSuper, where she posts information on the progress of developing the return to school plans. And so for more details on what was discussed, you can refer to the LPS Back to School Blueprints, which are linked in the show notes of this episode. The students of the Lexington Public Schools appreciate all the work you have done in making sure we receive a proper education while also being safe during these times. Once again, thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, and good luck to you as you return to school.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Open Floor.
Please follow us on whatever platform you get your podcasts on, and a full list of where to find us is at openfloor.me/listen.
Additionally, please follow us on Instagram at Openfloor Podcast or on Twitter at The Open Floor for updates on whenever we upload a new episode, and much more.
Consider supporting the podcast by visiting our new and improved website at openfloor.me.
I'd also like to thank our wonderful editor, Amin Purgul Mohammed, for editing this and all of our episodes.
I'm Ali Mosallai,
And I'm Arya Narayan.
and we'll see you in the next episode of Open Floor.